Right. How and why did classical liberalism emerge as a philosophy from the 17th to the 19th centuries?
I think a number of factors contributed to the rise of classical liberalism. Certainly the growth of constitutionalism, the idea that monarchies, if they do exist, should be restrained by law, and that individuals should have some influence on the choice of their governments, and especially that whatever government people choose should be limited. John Locke's work in the late 17th century perhaps provided the philosophical foundations for classical liberalism because of the claim that all government should be based upon consent, and his argument for the justification of, on occasions, overturning a government. Of course, an additional point which he stressed very strongly was individual right to property. And this claim to property was justified in ethics and in terms of one's labour expended on the fruits of the earth. It was justified in ethics and was held to be a right which government could not interfere with without consent. At the same time, historical forces were at work. The growth of private markets, the growth of commercial contracts, the growth of international trade. And this was in fact part of the gift of history for classical liberals. They discovered, without really thinking it through, that trade worked. It led to increased efficiency and prosperity, and they wrote about it. And of course people like Adam Smith, when he wrote his famous work The Wealth of Nations in 1776, had absorbed vast amounts of previous history as well as previous economics, and in a sense reconstructed an economic order based upon individual choice, and expressed very forcibly the idea that markets coordinate individual choices without central direction. And of course his famous metaphor of the invisible hand guiding selfish individuals to produce a general common good which was no part of their intentions was a great achievement in the rise of classical liberal thought. And I suppose the legacy of Adam Smith was the most important economic doctrine, and throughout the 19th century the growth of free trade between nations was seen to be efficiency enhancing, and the combination of growing secularization, growing commercial interests, and growing emphasis on constitutionalism led to, I suppose, what you might call the heyday of classical liberal thought in the mid-19th century, where in England most barriers to free trade had been removed. The aristocratic domination of government had begun to be slightly modified by the rise of early democratic ruled institutions. So you could say it was a confluence of a whole number of things. Growth in individualist philosophy from Locke, the rise of secularization, the growth of the common law, and, of course, the visible benefits that free trade brought people.
Thank you. What impact did classical liberalism have on world history in this period?
I suppose the biggest impact must have been in America with the American Revolution, because that was based upon the individualist ideas of consent to government, the protection of property, and the idea that government could be held to account to the people through strict constitutional laws. So when one speaks of impact on the world stage, it has to be the American experience, because that led to the most successful capitalist economy the world has known, at least historically. Japan may be steaming ahead right now, but in terms of world history, one has to point to America, because it seems to be the only country that was specifically founded upon doctrines that can be loosely described as classical liberal. Of course, other world events which were equally important, like the French Revolution, had little to do with classical liberalism, and much more to do with a sort of rationalism which many classical liberals had opposed. The rationalism of the French Revolution was based upon the idea that one could restructure a society according to an abstract plan. The main efforts of classical liberal philosophers was to show that the benefits of civilization are due to spontaneous coordination of people's activities, not the laying down of a precise plan. So, to some extent, in Europe, the classical liberals had a lot less impact than they would have liked, at least outside England. In fact, in terms of world events, it's very difficult to find good examples of classical liberalism having an impact. It has an impact on people's daily activities, really, and you can't see that as being as tangible as an impact on a revolution or the changing of a form of government. So I would suggest that the biggest impact was quite simply in the growth of the division of labour, the growth of the price mechanism as he allocated resources, and only later, when people reflect upon the past and reconstruct these events theoretically, only then can you see the impact. With the exception of America, I can't imagine many examples from history of direct impact. Of course, in England there were other impacts rather than the purely economic one. I suspect the triumph of the common law, whereby by the use of judge-made rules, people discovered they could organize their lives without statutes. That had a very great long-term impact until the late 19th century, when statute began to gradually take the place of common law rules. But it is very much a Western European phenomenon, and also a phenomenon brought by Western Europeans to the New World. And that is really where its impact lies. Of course, classical liberalism proved itself to be powerless against rising statist forces, where national imperatives and, if you like, tribal attitudes began to become obstacles to the gradual spontaneous growth of trade and law.
Thank you. Why was classical liberalism eclipsed by the rise of statism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries?
I always find that a very difficult question to answer. I think if you're talking about the decades following the 1930s, you can see why statism arose then. The mistaken belief that the Depression had to be solved by Keynesian macroeconomic policies. Most important, the rise of the democratic voting mechanism meant that people could, without realizing it, vote in long-term counterproductive policies. That was clearly a phenomenon that classical liberalism pointed out as occurring after the Second World War. But the late 19th century and early 20th century are difficult periods. One would have thought that the success of the classical liberal program would have ensured it much greater success at that time, but it didn't. I suspect because while industrialization proved to be in the long-term interest of everybody, it also produced quite visible adverse effects on certain people. Dickens could write about the misery caused by rapid growth and rapid industrialization. It was visible. What wasn't visible was the misery continually produced by backward rural societies. And once people notice something is not as pleasant as they would like it to be, it's very easy for them to devise from the imagination schemes for improvement. And undoubtedly in England in the late 19th century, such schemes were already coming to the fore. Perhaps equally important is the fact that classical liberalism is very much a doctrine that benefits abstract, unnamed individuals. And over time, you can say that a whole community will benefit. But that means that we have to ignore, or at least explain away, those who might be harmed in a short-run process. Now, certain other doctrines have an immediate impact upon people's imagination, nationalism being an extremely good example of that. And undoubtedly, just as classical liberalism was proven to be successful in the 19th century, the rise of nationalism, if not eclipsing classical liberalism, certainly began to replace it, not only in the minds of the intellectuals, but equally importantly, in the imagination of the people. Great European empires were breaking up, and the idea of the nation-state was coming to the fore. And since the nation-state is a romantic idea, it attracts people in a more immediate way than classical liberalism, which is a rather cold, rational idea, despite its anti-rationalist foundations. It's not something which is sellable in a way that the ideas of community, race indeed, tribe, and of course nation, and all the symbols that go along with that. Because classical liberalism deals in abstractions like the market and the rule of law, it, I think, has always had a problem in having a direct political appeal. As nationalism began to dominate European history at the end of the 19th century, as warlike postures and bellicose attitudes, the very things that Adam Smith has criticised, as they came to the fore, they simply displaced the commercial imperative. And that was perhaps the tragedy of European history. What was described by Adam Smith as the one form of social organisation that gradually and slowly gets rid of warlike, tribal attitudes, he described that extremely well. But unfortunately, he was wrong in his prediction. It just didn't work out that way. Cobden thought that international free trade would lead to a decline in disputes between nations. It didn't. And that is simply an historical tragedy.
Thank you. What differences hang on, sorry, I've got number 3 now. Why is classical liberalism?
Yeah, I think we should go for that, yeah.
Yeah, sure. Sorry. Why has classical liberalism revived in recent decades?
There are some, I think, fairly straightforward reasons why it has revived in recent decades. In economic terms, some of the economic plans and theories that came after the Second World War, over a period of 20-30 years, proved to be unsuccessful. A classical liberal emphasis in the past on the control of the money supply was relaxed in the post-war period, and rampant inflation eventually produced tangible and visible harms. The idea that an economy could be planned and directed towards predetermined ends gradually broke down, certainly in Britain in the mid-1970s, and there was a doctrine lying around waiting to be picked up and used against inflationary ideas, macroeconomics and central planning. I think classical liberalism was particularly adept at attacking the idea that there could be some kind of neat modus vivendi between the market and the state. This, I suppose, was the ruling post-war paradigm. What the classical liberals pointed out was that once you have that midway point, then you really have no way of preventing a gradual decline into the collectivist style of economic reasoning and indeed economic practice. Another important fact was that certainly in Britain the rise of the trade unions and the granting to trade unions certain legal privileges and a voice in government proved to be counterproductive, because trade unions would never fulfill their role in government planning, because they were there to represent the interests of their members, and ultimately their role as representing the interests of their members clashed with their role as a partner in government in this middle way between the market and the state. And I think in Britain that was a very important fact in the late 1970s, where incomes policies, which are typical devices to get between the market and the state, simply broke down because the unions could not be expected to cooperate in plans which seem to be in the short-run interests of their members. A whole number of other facts are equally important, and one must really stress the decline in confidence, the decline that people had in government. Government promised too much. They could not deliver. People actually looked to other countries, oddly enough, some countries in Southeast Asia and parts of the Third World, which had much more open and much more market-oriented economies than Britain did, seemed to be doing remarkably well. Hong Kong, of course, is a classic example. So, of all the reasons why classical liberalism began to revive in the post-war period, one would have to list the realization that inflation is a long-term bad policy, as Keynes himself knew. The failure of grandiose schemes to deliver the goods, the damage to the social fabric that was caused by collectivist pressure groups such as trade unions, and the gradual recognition from evidence from the rest of the world really that markets do work. A more moralistic point was not actually appreciated, but I think it's of long-term importance. People began to distrust the state anyway. People began to worry about civil liberties. And although the people who worry about civil liberties don't always worry about economic liberties, classical liberals showed quite convincingly that there is a very clear connection between civil and economic liberties. That, in fact, I think is a very important, long-run, if you like, philosophical premise of classical liberalism.
Thank you. What differences What differences exist between classical liberalism and libertarianism?
This is the question, I think, that is most frequently asked about individualist thought. And to some extent, there are few differences between classical liberalism and libertarianism. Both believe in free markets. Both believe that free markets not only produce prosperity, but they also provide some institutional protection for individual autonomy and individual rights. Both believe that impersonal abstract rules of law are essential prerequisites for any kind of orderly and stable society, and indeed any society that can properly protect individual liberty. The differences, I think, arise out of a question of moderation versus extremism, and also arise out of a question of the foundations of the respective doctrines. It's certainly true that classical liberals are less extreme. They are more cautious in their approach to government. They would, certainly people like Hayek, would suggest that it is as dangerous to overturn an established government on some abstract classical liberal principle as it is to overturn a stable government on some socialist principle. So the classical liberals take a much more sceptical view of the possibilities of grand scale reform, and would tend to argue that over a long period the benefits of the market and individual liberty will simply be made visible for all to see, and they would want to be careful how they go about government action to bring about this state of affairs. They perhaps want to compensate losers who certainly would exist in some radical scheme of marketization. They would think that certain historical privileges, although irrational from a theoretical classical liberal position, simply have to be either tolerated or at least broken down very gradually. And they are much more concerned to limit government, whatever it does, rather than simply plan for a government that will do nothing as some kind of abstract idea. So it is to do with the role of government that the differences emerge. Libertarians are quite prepared to wind up the welfare state because it's A, irrational, and B, destructive of people's individual rights, and not bother too much about the likely consequences of doing that, because they would think that it is right that we wind up the welfare state. Classical liberals are more sceptical. Who knows what's right? In the long term, certain sorts of social arrangements will simply prove their worth. So that really brings us to the theoretical difference between classical liberalism and libertarianism. And it does tend to turn upon the question of individual and natural rights. Libertarians believe that rights function as boundaries around people, and it is simply immoral for the state to overstep those boundaries. So that libertarians normally don't worry too much about the consequential advantages of free markets. They worry much more about the threat to rights that would come if government started to, and government has done, if government impinged upon free markets. So the natural rights basis of libertarianism is very strong. So, for example, libertarians would say that the government should not ever interfere with contracts between people, contracts between the drug supplier and the drug addict, because of the fact that this is an uncoerced exchange, there are no victims, and therefore government is simply violating people's rights when it prevents such uncoerced exchanges. The libertarian isn't too worried about some possible consequences that might occur from the immediate removal of such laws. Now, classical liberals, although they might occasionally use the language of right, do not stress it. They tend to see rights emerging from, say, a common law process. They tend to see rights as certain claims that people have over justly acquired property, but within an ongoing system of law which may not itself be based upon rights. So classical liberals tend to be therefore much more anxious to stress the good consequences that emerge from the operation of free markets, not the fact that such free markets exemplify people's natural rights. So you would find that libertarians are in a sense permanent revolutionaries, because most of the time government violates somebody's rights, and since rights violation is a fundamental moral principle, they are always likely to be in conflict with government. Classical liberals are really much more concerned with pointing out the virtues of markets in terms of their coordinating properties, are much more concerned about the importance of law setting a set of conventions and standards of behaviour which makes life predictable, rather than protecting individual rights which they might think cannot be proved rationally anyway. The rights we have in this country normally derive from the common law. Statute often takes them away, but the common law is the greatest source of right in this country. Libertarians have a natural rights doctrine that is transportable across the world, and classical liberals, while believing in free trade, are doubtful whether such natural rights can be easily transported and planted into alien cultures. They are much more aware of the fact of the cultural dimensions of capitalism and worry intensely about its acceptability in what you might think were unpromising cultures, and there are many unpromising cultures in the world.
Thank you. What are the main teachings of the Austrian School of Economics?
This is a big topic. The Austrian School of Economics emerged out of the general ferment in economic ideas that occurred in the 1870s. It's called the Marginalist Revolution by technical economists. And the Austrians had a particular slant of that theory. The Marginalist theory shows how all prices... Sorry, can I start that bit again?
Sure, yeah.
This is extremely complex. The Marginalist Revolution established the idea that market prices determine the allocation of all resources in an economy, and that decentralized trading between agents is the source of economic value, and subjective choice is indeed the ultimate determinant of value. Not the labour embodied in the production of the product, but the fact that people prefer it. It is their subjective choice that determines the value of an economic product. And that applies to labour and capital too. Now, the Austrians, while being part of this revolution, were much more concerned to stress change, uncertainty, the fact that the future is unknowable, and were keen to show that market exchanges are ways in which people come to terms with change and uncertainty. You see, in some version of the marginalist economic doctrine, if you knew people's tastes, if you knew the production possibilities that exist in an economy, if you knew the cost of producing a certain good, then you could plan it and produce by central design what people want through their private choices, and that is the origins of market socialism. The Austrians said this was impossible because you can never know enough about an economy, precisely because the knowledge is dispersed across possibly millions of agents, consumers and producers. And the only way that knowledge can be determined, it can be coordinated, is through a price mechanism which indicates scarcities and indicates the costs of producing what people subjectively want. And they were most concerned to stress the role of risk takers, entrepreneurs, people who use their mental skills to discover gaps in the markets, to discover ways of bringing producers and consumers together, people who are adept at arbitrage. This sort of phenomena is not really covered by the standard economic doctrine of the market, because that's much more concerned with mathematicizing all the production possibilities of some idealized market. What Austrians were concerned to do was to show how markets actually work. Someone like Hayek has a very strong anti-scientistic motif in his thought. He just does not believe that a market can be considered in exactly the same scientific terms as a physical system like the universe or the earth can be shown by natural scientists. Hayek's great contribution was to show that the market is a spontaneous institution that men have discovered almost accidentally as a way of coping with ignorance and coping with a necessarily unknowable future. So that is the basic philosophical slant of Austrian economics. Perhaps the second most important feature of Austrian economics is the fact that some things have to be relied upon in a market, and the most important of those things, of course, is a stable monetary institution. And in a world of uncertainty, if the money instrument is completely unreliable, if it is subject to the will of government, and therefore it will be unreliable, people can make no plans for themselves with any kind of certainty. And it's, of course, individual plans, which when coordinated by the market, produce the benign outcome that Austrian economists have praised. So they would say that the market order itself will produce that monetary reliability. Traditionally, of course, it was through the gold standard. But there are various alternative versions of this. But the main Austrian contribution in this area is to keep government out of money. And they've pointed out that if governments are tempted to try to beat the market, to try to plan centrally something much better than the market can do through private actions of individuals, if government tries to do that, it will be tempted ultimately to rely upon the inflationary device to give sluggish economies temporary boosts. And of course the analogy between drug taking and inflation has often been made. It works for a few shots and then the effect wears off and you're left with permanent inflation and no lift to the sluggish economy. So that really dominated post-war Austrian thought, this argument that without a stable currency, no market's possible at all. And that's, I think, how they came back into the fore of economic life in the 70s with their anti-inflationary policies. Hayek used a famous phrase back in the late 30s and early 40s, which was, governments ought not to play upon the monetary instrument. Once you do that, you destroy that predictability that decentralized agents want. But of course, throughout the history of economic thought, their stress on individualism, private markets, their macroeconomic contributions have always been there. And especially this notion of entrepreneurship, this mental ability to see productive possibilities, to the ability of certain people to spot gaps in the market, to bring about a more benign state of affairs. That is completely absent in orthodox theory. That's why some market socialists have mistakenly thought that central planners can mimic the actions of entrepreneurs. Because the problem with entrepreneurs from a moral point of view is that they earn profits. Profit is, quite simply, earnings over and above marginal productivity. Socialist planners thought you could get an efficient economy where everybody gets their marginal product and nobody gets any profit. But the Austrians have pointed out that in a world of uncertainty, you have to have profit to motivate people to do the necessary coordinating activities.
Thank you.
I'm a fan of this topic.
Right, next one's, what are the main teachings of the Chicago School of Economics?
Well, there is a great dispute between Austrian economists and Chicago economists, and sometimes one feels that the Chicago economists are more hostile to the Austrian economists than they are to socialists, but you tend to get those sorts of, I think, sometimes theological disputes in other doctrines as well as classical liberalism. It's very difficult to say quite clearly what the differences are. The first difference that comes to mind is that Chicago economists are very much in the empiricist school of social science. They like to measure everything. They would demonstrate the virtues of capitalism and market arrangements by pointing out empirically the success it has had in comparison to known alternatives. Austrians are not completely non-empirical, but they do not have the empirical bias of the Chicagoans at all. Austrians like to reason from first principles, to reconstruct a market order in their own minds, and then look at the world around them and indicate the ways in which real-world markets bear out the kind of abstract reasoning that they like to go in for. So, for example, an Austrian economist would not be interested in demonstrating the empirical disbenefits or disadvantages from rent control. He would simply point out that the control of one price artificially by the government is bound to lead to shortages, and if you control the price of rented property, then people will queue for artificially priced homes. If the price is low, then entrepreneurs won't come forward to let housing property, and therefore that'll be another reason why you will get shortages. That is a matter of basically a priori reasoning for an economist. Chicago economists would of course agree with this theory, but he'd say that you must point out and measure the exact effects of particular acts of rent control. So if you take that difference and go between the two schools of thought and go to other areas in economic life, you'll find other examples of measurement versus theorizing. It's not that Chicagoans don't theorize, they do, but like to test all their theories. A very important example would be money. Chicago economists like Milton Friedman made their reputations by testing certain traditional monetary theories. The theory that the algebraic equation mv equals pt, which is the monetarist theorem. They measure v, the velocity of money, and they show over time, or claim to show over time, that it is stable, and therefore it would demonstrate that monetary injections simply raise prices and don't raise economic activity. Austrians, again, theorize rather than measure the effect of monetary disturbance. Therefore, Austrians developed the trade cycle theory, whereby they showed, through abstract reasoning, deductive reasoning, how a trade cycle can develop. The ups and downs of economic activity can be explained by showing how money has effect on the structure of production. They don't measure that effect. They say it must have because certain prices have been changed by the injection of money and credit into the economy, and that must have an effect on people's economic behavior, and that will reflect itself in a trade cycle. Chicago economists are not actually that much interested in trade cycles. They're much more interested in measuring the disturbances to equilibrium that will come about through monetary injection. So to that extent, Chicago economists, and there are other examples to show this, are equilibrium theorists. They do write about the possibility of an economy being in equilibrium, where supply and demand for goods and services perfectly balanced, and there are no inefficiencies brought about by monopoly or some other disturbance. And they like to describe that equilibrium in mathematical terms, and they like to measure any disturbance to that equilibrium brought about by government intervention. But I have to say that despite what Austrians and Chicago say about each other, they're much closer, really, than you would think from their comments. And the dispute can get a little theological.
Thank you. How and why did libertarianism emerge as a distinct ideology?
I think I should make the point that it will always be a minority ideology. I think libertarians, to some extent, display the features of almost all ideological thinking, and that is a desperate concern for the purity of the doctrine rather than the possibility of even a bit of it ever being realized. But it did emerge, at least for a short period after about, I think, 1970, as a distinct ideology. I think it emerged because not only did it have some sound economics behind it, but it was a rather attractive doctrine. It was an anti-statist doctrine. It was an individual right doctrine. And it stressed private property and independence that property brought individuals. Now that, of course, the property aspect didn't make it fashionable amongst young people in the 1970s. But gradually, when people realized the importance of private property, then it did have a greater impact. Amongst, say, American students, and a number did become libertarians in the 1970s, I think the experience of big American government, the Vietnam War, the clear evidence that the Great Society welfare programs of President Johnson were breaking down and did not work. These practical events, these historical circumstances inspired younger American libertarians. There was, of course, the novelist Ayn Rand, who had a particularly fierce, rigorous and consistent form of libertarianism, stressing egoism and individual self-assertion, and stressing the constant battle between individuals and the state. Since that was written in novel form, and indeed there are films of her novels, at least one film of one of her famous novels, the fact that it was in film form made it rather attractive, and the fact that it had very strong literary overtones made Randianism rather attractive. That, I suspect, had no influence on English students. I don't think Hayek had much influence on American libertarians, in an odd way, economically oriented. I don't mean odd in any curious sense, but rather it wasn't fashionable, put in that particular form. I don't think libertarianism ever had much impact politically. Classical liberalism did have impact politically because Mrs. Thatcher actually read some of the works, and she met people from the Institute of Economic Affairs, and she briefly met Hayek. But the libertarians, with their right doctrines,